Long, and it is great to be here to talk about street fight and street fights. And, but before I get started, I want to recognize the 4,500 people from the New York City Department of Transportation who worked so hard to not only keep our infrastructure in a state of good repair each and every day, but they were the ones that actually implemented the changes on the ground that I'm going to talk about this afternoon. And one person in particular who is my co-author, my colleague, my conciliary, and my counselor, and that is Seth Solomonow. So, Seth. So I'm going to start with a question. What do you all think about when you think about a street? This is actually a question. You have to answer the question. Cars, lights, people, activity, sidewalk dining. That's a new one. I haven't heard that one before. Space, shops, mail order covers. Okay, I'm going to end there before we go any further. Well, most people, when they think about a street that looks like this. And streets are what make a city great, and some cities not so great. And for generations, they've really been designed from this kind of dashboard view of the road. And for years and years, city leaders have taken a look at a street like this and said, yep, it's working just fine. This is exactly how our streets should be. And, you know, it doesn't have to be that way. Our streets in the past have really functioned more along the lines of our porches and our living rooms. This is actually here in Detroit on Griswold and Front. This intersection is 100 years ago. And this is the intersection today. Again, 100 years ago, and you see all of those choices for getting around simply whittled away. And our streets really morphed from being streets into something like highways. And streets can be lively places for people. But for most of the last century, they've been designed for cars with devastating results. We've got some 35,000 people that die on the streets of the United States every year. We've got chronic congestion. We've got lifeless downtowns. And these kinds of roads didn't just happen by chance. They actually happened by design. And you look at a street like this and you think, like, where are the people? And even if the people were there, where would they even walk to? Where would they go? And yet, almost all of the 2.5 million roads in the United States have been designed with this kind of template in mind. And it reminds me of this video game I used to play as a kid called Frogger. How many of you played Frogger? Right? I think this game should have been called Pedestrian. And here is the real-life translation. And there are all sorts of signs about how a street wants to be used. And you can see it when people are trying to cross mid-block, like right here. And it's a sign of how our streets have actually let people fall through the cracks. And you look at a street like this, and you think, you know, people actually have gotten so tired of constantly battling the car that they actually have given up the fight, that they forgot that our streets could be any different. And it's not that it was actually a fair fight. The federal government sets the standards for how our streets are designed, everything from the font on our signs to the width of the lanes on our roads. It's kind of like the 10 Commandments, but 500 pages long, with the best clip art, as you can see, that money can buy. They just forgot one thing: people. You can actually read through all 500 pages, and you won't find a single person there. And an emoji interpretation of this boils down to this. You start with a city, you add some roads and some stoplights, you take out those pesky pedestrians, and voila, you know, you've got a great road that, you know, tons of engineers are celebrating yet another job well done. Just don't try to cross that street on foot. But it doesn't have to be that way. It is possible to reclaim, to reimagine, to redesign our streets. And it just awaits those who care and those who dare. And our work in New York City stemmed from Mayor Bloomberg's Plan YC, a long-range sustainability plan that looked at how are we going to accommodate the 1 million more people that were expected to move to New York City by 2030 and still improve the quality of life in our neighborhoods and business districts, and how are we going to reduce carbon emissions by 30%. And that strategy had profound implications for our streets, how we designed our streets. So we worked hard to build in better bus systems, better bike and bike share systems, better plazas, making it more enjoyable for people to get around and appreciate the city, and make our streets safer. And by the end of the Bloomberg administration, New York City was a very different place. We created 400 miles of on-street bike lanes. We created the largest bike share system in North America, 7 rapid bus lines, the safest streets in 100 years. But that's the kind of short version of the story, and you can see those changes there. The slightly longer version of the story is that every day was a fight. A street fight, to give people more choices for getting around. Every inch of the 180 acres that we reclaimed for cars and we gave back to people on foot was a battle. And we were fighting to change the culture of New York, and we were trying to change the direction of New York City. And I learned a lot of lessons along the way that any of you can apply. And the first lesson is that you can paint the city that you want to see. A lot of people think, oh, well, you're in New York City, you had this big budget, you had this, it was all planned out, you just waved your wand and voila, the streets of New York had changed. That's not how it went. We started with the streets that we had and the budget that we had, and you can accomplish a lot by just using the traditional materials that you have slightly differently with something as simple as paint. And we wanted to show New Yorkers that change was possible. This is Times Square in the 1950s. And this is Times Square 60 years later. And you can see not much has changed. There are no tail fins on the cars. That's about it. But if you were in business and you didn't change your major capital asset in 50 years, do you think you'd still be in business? Probably not. And so a few months after my appointment, we actually got to work creating our first pedestrian plaza in Brooklyn, in Dumbo. And we transformed an underutilized parking lot into a plaza, literally over not more than a weekend. Painted the curbs, painted the plazas, put out tables and chairs. It didn't take millions, and it didn't take decades. It was a very profound change. How many of you actually have been to New York City? Okay, how many of you have been in the last 5 years? Okay, how many of you have been in the last 3 years? Last year. So our tourism program clearly rocks. So I'm totally psyched about that. So, you have seen these kinds of transformations. You've probably been to the 14th Street and seen what we did in the meatpacking district. We took an old, traffic pattern from another time and then took that space and created the first pedestrian plaza in New York City. And you can see it now. You see people are there day and night in that plaza. Apple Store moved next door. And what we found is that, it's actually hard now for people to remember even what it was like before. Because once you adapt a space, people adopt it. And we did this. We went further north at the Flatiron District, got the beautiful Flatiron building, and people would practically be killed, trying to take pictures just to capture the beauty of that building. We had a warren of streets come in, Fifth Avenue, 23rd Street, and Broadway came together. And it was one of the longest intersections, 170 feet in New York City. And we barreled it off. We created 65,000 square feet of new public space. And it was interesting. I love this slide because 2 hours after we put the barrels out, this art class was out, in the street, and it was I don't know where they were before, it was like Star Trek. Suddenly all these people were there, and people are starved for public space in New York City. And today it is one of the most successful public spaces in the city. People will choose to sit in the street, in the plaza, rather than in the beautiful park next door, just to feel the pulse of the city. And again, it didn't take millions of dollars, and it didn't take decades to do. You can do this anywhere. This is not just a recipe book for New York City. And after creating this showcase of projects, we actually took our toolkit to the crossroads of the world, to Times Square. Since all of you have been to New York City, you probably know that Manhattan's on a grid, north, south, east, west, and Broadway cuts diagonally through the grid. And it does great things, like it creates these plazas every time it crosses through those three-way intersections, but it also creates these kind of Gordian knots of traffic. And nothing worse than in Times Square. We have 350,000 people going through Times Square every day. 90% of the traffic in Times Square was on foot, and yet they only had 10% of the space. So it was a real problem of balance, and people had tried for years to try to fix Times Square, add slip lanes, tried different kind of signal patterns. Nothing worked. So we decided to try something bigger. We were going to close Broadway from 42nd to 47th Street, restore the grid, and invite people back to the street and provide them with a space that they needed. Because as you know, New Yorkers like to get around in a New York minute, right? We are kind of crazy that way. And so when you come to New York City with your friends and family, and I encourage you to continue to do that, you'll all walk like 4 people abreast, holding hands. And you'd look up and you're all excited about it, and we behind you are vibrating. We can't stand it. And so what we do is jump into the street, right? And we get hit by cars. And so it's a problem. And so this was a problem on lots of levels. Times Square wasn't working from a safety perspective, from an economic perspective, from a mobility perspective. So we brought this idea to Mayor Bloomberg, and we said, we're gonna close Broadway. Now this was in the middle of his re-election campaign in the summer. And so, I was in City Hall and on the second floor, and it's a beautiful building, and this kind of Knights of the Round Table, table, and he went around and he asked all of his deputy mayors what they thought about this idea. And let's just say not everybody thought that was such a great idea. And then the mayor actually turned to me, and my heart sank. I thought, oh, we're not going to be able to do this. And he said, I don't ask my commissioner to do the right thing according to the political calendar. I ask my commissioners to do the right thing, period. And he shook my hand and he said, let's do it. And it still gives me goosebumps, thinking about that moment today. And one of the reasons, I know, it was really an incredible moment. It was awesome. It was awesome. And so we did it as a pilot to try to test it out, to see if it was going to work. And if it would work, we would keep it. And if it didn't work, we'd put it back to the way that it was before. And that very much helped reduce the anxiety that people had about the project and got the buy-in of the local businesses and neighbors, because they could see and touch and feel it. And it wasn't like this dry engineering drawing and we went through this computer model. They could see it. And people came out immediately. And I have to tell you a quick little story. We'd closed it off the night before with the orange barrels, and we looked out at this expanse of 2.5 acres of asphalt, and there was nothing there. And we thought, oh, no, that's not good. And so we actually went to a discount hardware store, Pinchick, and we bought $10.99 beach chairs. And we put those beach chairs out the next day. And so the story the next day was not that we closed Times Square to cars. The story was the beach chairs. Did we like the beach chairs? The color of the beach chairs? How did people feel about the beach chairs? So when you all have big projects that are controversial, beach chairs. Just buy beach chairs and you will be fine. And so, New Yorkers, hard-nosed New Yorkers who wouldn't have been caught dead in Times Square before, it became this great new living room. And the innovation, the reconstruction work continues today. We've got a big digital upgrade, and we've got permanent seating that's there. And it's now worthy of its name, the crossroads of the world. And by any measure, it was a big success. And of course, we, as I mentioned, did a lot of measuring. And very important, because I worked for a very data-driven mayor in Mike Bloomberg. As he used to say, in God we trust, everyone else bring data. And so we did. And importantly, and I think it's important to talk about the language of change. You know, we didn't talk about this project when we launched it as about, you know, these pedestrian plazas. That was part of the presentation that we made to communities, but we talked about it in terms of traffic and green light for Midtown, which everybody could understand. You know, we could make traffic flow work better. But we also developed new ways to measure what was happening beyond just the traffic flow, and we looked at the safety benefits and the mobility benefits. And we found that there were 80% fewer people walking on the road, pedestrian injuries and motorist injuries went way down, travel times improved 17%. We measured that because we had GPS devices in all 13,000 yellow cabs, and it became one of the top 10 retail locations on the planet. And again, providing that space for people. And it's really important. You know, one of the things that when I first got to New York City DOT, I think I wasn't there more than about a year when there were actually a group of artists that went out to Fifth Avenue. And you've all been to Fifth Avenue. You've seen what those sidewalks are like. They're crowded, much like Times Square. And so this group of artists actually went out and they striped the sidewalk on Fifth Avenue. And they wrote on one side was visitors and the other side was New Yorkers. And people followed it. It was incredible. You know, and they were out there saying, like, you know, people would appeal like, well, but I walk as fast as a New Yorker. No, you know, you can't, you're not a New Yorker. You got to stay in the visitor lane. And I got all of these letters from New Yorkers saying, like, that's a great idea. You know? So, you know, people are hungry for space. And we actually use this kind of analysis, this safety and mobility, you know, looking at more than just traffic flow, people flow, pedestrian flow. And we use this kind of new analysis on all of our different projects. And we found that on streets with protected bike lanes, retail sales went up 50%. We saw similar results on our plazas. We saw similar results on our rapid bus lines. And I think it really points to a really important maxim, and that is that cars don't shop, people do. And yes, it's a very important idea. And for all of you, it's really important. This data was key. Because it actually turned some of our biggest critics, you know, small business owners, our biggest critics, into some of our largest supporters. And we moved from streets that were governed by anecdote, you know, talking to a cabbie saying, like, what do you think of this project? And they go, you know, to streets that are governed by analysis. But putting aside the economics, there's nothing more important than safety and saving lives. And we examined crash and injury data from 7,000 crashes. And that became our investment strategy. We found out the who, what, where, when, and why of these crashes, and it prioritized our work. And this kind of data-driven approach, you know, we actually said that we wanted to cut traffic fatalities by 50%. We were one of the first cities in the country to commit to a specific number, not just say we want to reduce fatalities, but commit to a number. And this kind of data-driven approach has now been expanded by mayors across the country from, you know, Chicago, San Francisco, LA, New York, Seattle, San Antonio. And these mayors are committing to Vision Zero because they understand that with analysis and leadership, these kinds of crashes can be prevented and predicted. And it also demonstrates that these kinds of great ideas can cross borders. And now we've got 15 mayors that are signed on for Vision Zero, and we think there's much more of that work to come. So, but no one has a patent on pavement. And when you think about it, when you see an idea that works in another city, try it out, bring it back to your city. You know, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And so shortly after starting at DOT, I actually took a trip to Bogota to see about the innovations that put them on the map, checked out their BRT system, which took trips that used to be hours into minutes. Which had a great implication for New York City buses. We had the largest bus fleet in North America. We have the slowest bus speeds. As you know, because you've been there, you can actually walk across town faster than taking the bus. In fact, we prove it every year with a competition between a person on a trike and the person driving the bus. And guess who wins every year? That's right, the trike wins every year. And it just underscores a maxim from one of my traffic engineers who said that the only way to get across town in New York is to be born there. So we thought that wasn't a great strategy. And so we imported the BRT concept from Bogota, adapted it on our own. We painted the lanes red, used off-board fare collection. You pay before you get on the bus, camera-enforced lanes, and traffic signal prioritization to get those buses through. 7 new lines across all 5 boroughs, 20% decrease in travel time, 10% increase in ridership. Again, doesn't take billions, doesn't take years to get done. You can build in that new mobility quickly. I also made a trip to Copenhagen that year, and like almost everybody else in American traffic management, I had never seen a parking protected bike lane. I thought, what a cool idea that is. You know, you can maintain the parking and you can use those cars as a physical barrier to protect cyclists. So traveled around with Jan Gell and then came back. This is on 9th Avenue in Manhattan. You can see what the street looks like before. We put the first parking protected lane down that year, and it, you know, parking and people traded places, and it really became the start of a new era for cyclists, and we expanded that all across town. We also created a new biking backbone for New Yorkers. This is the bike system in 2007, and this is the bike lane system in 2013. And I love doing this one because it looks so easy. Oh yeah, you just, no, voila, then all those lanes are just there. And you're seeing this kind of explosion of new infrastructure across the country. These parking protected lanes are now in 53 cities since we put the first one in almost 10 years ago. And you're seeing in Seattle, Indianapolis, Atlanta, Chicago. But it is not just about moving bikes, it's about moving people. And by following the footsteps of people, you can see the possibilities that are literally hidden in plain sight in your city. And, you know, whether it is the need for a crosswalk, you know, at a very busy mid-avenue crossing. This is on 51st Street between 6th and 7th, and people would, you know, not walk to the avenues to cross. And so it was between 6th and 7th Avenue, so we channeled a little Harry Potter and we created 6.5 Avenue. And this now goes for 9 blocks, so the next time you're in Midtown, I encourage you to check out 6.5 Avenue. But, you know, you can see these possibilities outlined. You know, people will show you where we need to build. You know, you can see this in, you know, the trampled grass, you know, the neighborhood's clearly crying out for a new crosswalk. And it's sending a message. And by looking at where people are walking today, you can see the city of tomorrow. And following the people just doesn't stop with street design. We actually turned the community engagement process on its head. And we asked neighbors to tell us where they wanted these plazas to be. They would apply to the New York City Department of Transportation, and they took ownership of the places that the city would create. They would get the political sign-offs, they would get the maintenance agreements in place, and by following the people and giving them the power, you can truly transform a city. And the community is going to apply for everything from sidewalk seating to bike corrals to totally cool David Byrne bike racks. That's in hipster Williamsburg. And in a city where this used to pass as public seating, really not great for seniors or families with kids, you know, just crouching on that fire hydrant. We created a public bench program and asked people where they wanted these new benches to be. And we also started a wayfinding system for making it easier for pedestrians to get around. We have a great system of signs for cars and not a really great system of signage for people walking. And we started this program after we did a survey, and we found out that at any point in time, 10% of New Yorkers are lost. Right? And that's just the 10% that would admit it. So we knew we had a problem, and this program was about making it easier for people to get around, and we asked them to be a part of the process, which leads me to my next point, which is that the public domain is in the public's domain, and people will fight to defend it, you know, to change it, to put it back to the way that it was. So a city that is looking to make big changes will naturally have a kind of push-pull relationship with community groups. And building those relationships is as important as anything that you do in concrete, asphalt, and steel. And the advocacy community in New York City played a huge role. And there is a growing number of New Yorkers that are passionate about their streets and are fighting to take them back. And we had great community leaders, Eric McClure, Transportation Alternatives, Paul Steely-White, Clarence Eckerson at Street Films, Brad Lander from the City Council, really true leaders. And organizations like Families for Safe Streets, who took ownership of this crucial issue and channeled their terrible losses into meaningful action and actually lowered the speed limit in New York City. How many people here are involved in advocacy groups or community groups making change on the ground? Well, so again, another big thank you for what you are doing, because that's the crucial work of change, and it can be, you know, tiresome, it's long and hard to do, but that is a necessary prerequisite for change. Now, if I made it seem easy, you know, there were certainly bumps in the road, and I found out that when you push the status quo pushes back hard. So this, how many know what street this is? Prospect Park West, exactly. This is actually one of the most famous streets in New York City, thanks to a great lawsuit that was filed. This was the before condition. You know, we had lots of speeding cars, we had people riding on the sidewalks, the community asked us to fix it, so we put in a two-way protected bike lane. We saw speeding drop 75%. We saw bike ridership triple, nobody's riding on the sidewalk anymore. Great news, right? Everybody's totally happy? So, not quite. These were actually protesters who came out to protest the project, saying that the slower speeds somehow made the street less safe. I know. And my favorite sign, don't be conned by Sadik-Khan. I mean, at least they were clever. And one local newspaper called it the most contested slab of concrete outside the Gaza Strip. And you can see what they found so threatening. You know, extremely threatening, you know. And I actually thought it was really funny too until they filed the lawsuit. And unfortunately, the lawsuit's still here. I testified just 8 weeks ago on this. And so, you know, I realized that if the lawsuit was a child, it would actually be old enough to ride in this bike lane. And bike lash is not just a New York City phenomenon. You've all been there, you know what the symptoms are, and you can see it when you get headlines like these. And a surreal part of bike lash is actually having to defend actions that make your streets safer rather than defending them, leaving them in their dangerous status quo state. But you have to stand your ground and make decisions based on policy and not on press. And when we launched the city bike system, we did actually the largest outreach in US transportation history. And we had, it was a system of 6,000 bikes, 330 stations. We knew it would be really popular, but we also knew we would be criticized along the way. And a local magazine analyzed why it elicited such strong reactions in New Yorkers, that we didn't like anything healthy, anything environmental, anything that involved sharing, or anything that was vaguely French. I know, I have this framed in my office. And a tipping point in the backlash came from this Wall Street Journal video rant against the bikes. And one editorial member called us bike crazed and said she represented the majority of New Yorkers who opposed the bikes, that they begrimed the city. And she also called out the bike advocates, saying that they were part of this totalitarian mayor's campaign, that they were part of this all-powerful bike lobby. And we, of course, loved that. We got little buttons printed up that said all-powerful bike lobby that we walked around. It was really great. But my hero, Jon Stewart, really told it like it was. Just effing bikes. Just effing bikes. Yeah. So I think bike lash is a sign that you are doing something right. It's what happens when you challenge the status quo and you move to a new road order. And today, a typical rider looks much more like the guy on the right than the guy on the left, the kind of Mad Max messenger. And it is a major step, people using bikes for commuting, getting around, getting married. We didn't even stage this photo. And this hunger is out there. You're seeing that even here in Detroit with the slow roll. I mean, thousands and thousands of people coming out. And it is popular. And people are ahead of the press and the politicians when it comes to their streets. By the end of the Bloomberg administration, we saw a 73% support for bike shares, 72% support for plazas, a 64% support for bike lanes. If this was an election, it would be a landslide. And we saw just how much had changed about 6 months ago when the new administration talked about taking out the plazas in Times Square to deal with the scantily clad desnudas and these costume characters like Hello Kitties. And they said, we want to put it back to the way that it was. And let's just say the idea did not go over well. New Yorkers came out in droves to defend Times Square and the plazas all over the city. And when you think about it, 6 years ago, people had dramatically opposed taking the cars out of Times Square. And 6 years later, they were dramatically opposed to putting them back. It was a new status quo. And we are seeing this new status quo reflected in a series of all sorts of new design guides that get us past the MUTCD, that get us back past the AASHTO Green Book, the kind of work that CNU is doing. And the NACTO design guides, National Association of City Transportation Officials, developed all of these new guides, and you see it on the new streets of Seattle with the new design guide. You can see this in Philadelphia. You can see this in Vancouver. You can see this in LA. Protected lanes in LA, total seismic shift underway there. Salt Lake City, on the streets of Toronto at Queens Quay, Chicago, the new loop, Battery Park City in New York City with the bike share guide, Indianapolis, Philly, Sao Paulo, same kinds of changes. We're going to be releasing a global street design guide this fall, Medellin, and new ideas also. It's stimulating new ideas. This is Northern Boulevard, and talking a little bit to where Susan was going, with the dawn of autonomous vehicles, there's all sorts of concrete and asphalt and steel that we can reclaim for green infrastructure. As long as we don't lose our eyes on the prize, we have to make sure that our streets are designed for people and not for shiny toys, and we don't repeat the mistakes of the last 50 years. These are plans for Byward Market in Toronto, again, creating a new pedestrian-friendly environment. And right here in Detroit, on Rivard Plaza, these great new designs here, and I think Mike Duggan and Maurice Cox have some incredible energy and new ideas that are going to really be transformative here in Detroit. And this is Campus Martia's plans, and as executed, and it's really exciting. And I just have to close by saying, this is not a new approach. This operating code is not new. Jane Jacobs wrote about this over 55 years ago. And you all are doing the hard work of translating that vision into reality on the ground and actually accelerating the pace of change. And it is really important work. And we all know that it is a fight to make space for people. It is actually a street fight. But it is a fight that we can win, and it is a fight that we must win. Because when you change the street, you change the world. Thank you. Ha ha ha!